Two white officers thought they'd just made another easy bust, but the calm black woman they slapped cuffs on had been hunting them for months. It was just past 8 p.m. on a quiet stretch of Highway 19 outside Brookhaven, Georgia. The sky was fading orange, the pine trees casting long shadows across the two-lane road. The woman behind the wheel, 40-year-old Danielle Brooks, wasn't speeding, wasn't swerving, and had nothing illegal in her car. But that didn't stop the flashing lights from appearing in her rearview mirror. She pulled over without hesitation, rolled her window down, and placed both hands on the wheel like she'd done this before. Within minutes, she was ordered out, her trunk popped, her belongings rifled through, and her wrists bound behind her back. The officers claimed they found cocaine in her suitcase and didn't bother explaining much else. Danielle didn't argue. She didn't panic. She just watched and waited. Because behind those steady eyes wasn't fear, it was a calculation. Danielle Brooks, a 40-year-old black woman, had just wrapped up a medical conference in Savannah and was making the quiet drive home in her modest silver Toyota Corolla. Dressed in slacks and a soft cotton blouse, she didn't look like someone who attracted attention, and that was the point. Her life ran on structure and routine, both personal and professional. She kept her playlists mellow, her schedule tight, and her conversations minimal. She wasn't flashy, she didn't need to be, but somewhere along Highway 19, her predictability became the reason she was targeted. The patrol car emerged from a gas station parking lot, tailed her for exactly 3 miles, then lit up. Danielle pulled over with calm precision, rolled down her window, and waited. Officer Bradley Moore was the first to approach, tall, broad, and exuding the kind of authority that didn't require explanation. His right hand hovered near his holstered weapon as he barked, "License and registration." No greeting, no smile, just protocol masked in dominance. Behind him, Officer Kent Wallace leaned against the back quarter panel of her car, arms folded, sunglasses still on, despite the fading light. His posture was casual, but the grin tugging at his mouth wasn't friendly. It was practiced. Danielle handed over her documents without a word. Moore barely glanced at them before nodding toward the trunk. "Pop it," he said. She hesitated. "Is there a reason?" Wallace stepped forward, the grin disappearing. "You got a problem?" "No," she replied coolly and released the latch. They didn't find anything at first, just a suitcase, a tote bag, a folder of notes from her conference. But then Moore called out, "Here we go," holding up a small bag of white powder. Danielle didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She just looked him in the eye and said evenly, "You're making a big mistake." They didn't respond. They didn't need to. Their faces already said it all. This wasn't the first time. They were too confident, too rehearsed, too fast with their discovery. Wallace muttered something to Moore under his breath and chuckled, already assuming this was just another arrest to slide into their stats. Danielle was told to exit the vehicle. She complied. She was handcuffed beside the open trunk, facing the road as passing cars slowed to gawk. But her mind was elsewhere, running through every step, every move, every detail of what was unfolding. She knew this wasn't a mistake. It was a setup, and she'd seen it before. The only difference this time, they had no idea who they were playing with. At the station, Danielle Brooks was processed like a textbook criminal. Rough hands, cold voices, and zero explanation. Her belongings were taken without protocol, her questions ignored, and before she could ask for a lawyer, she was escorted into a sterile side room where a female officer handed her a paper gown and told her to strip. The examination was invasive, impersonal, and performed with the kind of mechanical detachment that suggested this wasn't new for them. It was just another part of the system. No dignity, no discretion. Danielle complied without a word. She had endured worse, and she knew now wasn't the time to fight, it was the time to observe. Once back in the holding cell, she took a seat on the cold bench bolted to the wall. Her hands cuffed in front of her, her clothes replaced by a scratchy jail-issued jumpsuit. Danielle looked more like a suspect than a federal agent. That was the point. They wanted her to feel small. But inside, her mind was alive. She scanned the room, a smudged wall camera tucked above the door, a clipboard of intake forms on the counter, Officer Wallace whispering something to Moore near the hallway. "Easy money," Wallace said with a chuckle, his voice low but not low enough, like taking candy from a baby. Moore snorted in agreement. She's not even pushing back. Danielle kept her head down, letting the words imprint themselves on her memory. She knew how to catalogue details: the sound of a voice, the rhythm of a lie, the names on uniforms, and the smell of bleach on a deputy's gloves. Every second was evidence, every insult, data. She asked for a phone call and was told to wait. She requested to see an attorney and got a shrug. The staff moved around her with detached routine, unaware or unwilling to see the trap they were walking into. She wasn't resisting because she was afraid. She was waiting, calm, calculating, and watching them build a case that would eventually bury themselves. They thought she was just another unlucky woman who wouldn't know how to fight back. But Danielle had trained for situations like this. She had handled cartel lieutenants, flipped confidential informants, and run surveillance operations across 3 states. These 2 officers had no idea how far out of their depth they were. While they joked and congratulated themselves on another easy frame-up, she was already formulating the next move, already piecing together the story she'd soon use to dismantle theirs. All they saw was an inmate in a cell. What they didn't see was a federal agent gathering ammunition in silence. The next morning's preliminary hearing was held in a small courtroom tucked inside the Brookhaven County Courthouse, its wood-paneled walls faded from age and ceiling fans groaning above as if reluctantly summoned. Danielle was led in through a side door, shackled at the wrists and ankles, still wearing the baggy orange jumpsuit issued the night before. She sat beside a disinterested public defender who had yet to ask her a single question. Across the aisle, Officers Moore and Wallace stood upright, fresh in pressed uniforms and polished boots, exuding confidence. The clerk rattled off the charges: possession with intent to distribute, tampering with evidence, and use of encrypted devices. The judge, a stocky man with graying temples and a permanent scowl, raised an eyebrow as he skimmed the report in front of him. "This file was put together fast," he muttered. "Barely 12 hours since booking, and you've already got the narrative locked down." Officer Wallace stepped forward, voice steady and overly rehearsed. "Your Honor, the suspect was in possession of 2 mobile devices. One of them, encrypted at a level we don't typically see outside military or government clearance." The judge paused, his expression shifting. "And you're saying this woman, a pharmaceutical consultant, had a military-grade phone?" Wallace nodded. "She refused to unlock it, claimed it was personal." The judge leaned back, visibly unconvinced. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, the courtroom doors creaked open. A tall man in a charcoal-grey suit stepped in, briefcase in hand, moving with the kind of purpose that didn't need to announce itself. He walked directly to the bench, ignoring the puzzled expressions of the bailiff and clerk. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "my name is Special Agent Marcus Vance, with the DEA. I need to speak with you in chambers immediately." The judge narrowed his eyes. "About what?" Vance opened the briefcase and placed a sealed folder on the bench. "About her," he said, gesturing to Danielle. "That folder contains clearance documents from the Department of Justice, sealed warrants, and a full operational file. Danielle Brooks is not a suspect. She is a federally embedded undercover DEA agent who has spent the last 11 months investigating systemic corruption in multiple Southern law enforcement agencies, including this one." The room fell silent. Moore shifted his weight uncomfortably. Wallace's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The judge didn't speak at first. He simply opened the folder and flipped through the first few pages. His eyes darkened as he read, and the furrow in his brow deepened. "Clear the courtroom," he finally said, voice flat. "Everyone out, except Special Agent Vance and Miss Brooks." As the room emptied, Danielle stood slowly, the bailiff moving to unlock her chains without instruction. Moore's eyes darted between her and the agent. Wallace whispered something under his breath, something that sounded like, "What the hell is going on?" But the answer had already walked through the door, and it brought the truth with it. Inside Judge Whitmore's chambers, the atmosphere shifted from skeptical curiosity to stunned realization as Special Agent Marcus Vance spread out the full scope of Operation Quiet Chain across the polished oak desk. The documents, marked confidential and sealed under federal authority, outlined a months-long undercover investigation targeting a growing pattern of abuse within small-town law enforcement agencies across southern Georgia. At the center of it all were officers Bradley Moore and Kent Wallace. Danielle Brooks, whose real identity had been buried under layers of strategic cover, had spent the last 6 months tracking their movements, documenting inconsistencies in evidence logs, GPS routes that didn't match official reports, and communications that hinted at collusion with known traffickers. She had identified a clear pattern: random traffic stops of vulnerable individuals, usually women, usually traveling alone, followed by planted substances, fabricated charges, and rapid bookings designed to push plea deals before questions could be raised. The only thing missing had been hard, indisputable proof. Until the night they stopped her. The encrypted burner phone they had seized but failed to access. It contained a full log of encrypted field notes, time-stamped recordings, and metadata synced with DEA servers. The body cam footage, which had been tampered with at the precinct, had already been recovered by the Federal Forensic Unit working with Vance. One particular clip showed Officer Moore removing a bag from his own jacket pocket and discreetly placing it into Danielle's trunk, while Wallace kept her distracted. Another video showed them discussing what charges would stick best. These files, along with internal text messages between the two officers joking about another one going down, painted a picture too detailed and too damning to deny. Judge Whitmore, known for his no-nonsense demeanor, sat back in his chair, jaw clenched. He tapped the folder twice, then looked up at Vance and Danielle. "You're telling me they've done this before?" he asked, voice low. "More times than we can prove today," Vance replied, "but enough to warrant full federal charges and the reopening of at least 17 prior cases." Danielle didn't flinch. She met the judge's eyes and spoke for the first time since the room had cleared. "I let them think they won, because I needed to see how far they'd go. Now we know." Whitmore stood and adjusted his robe. "Then let's finish this the right way." Minutes later, back in open court, the doors swung open and Judge Whitmore returned to the bench with a thunderous expression. Danielle followed, no longer in shackles. Moore and Wallace stood, visibly confused. The bailiff posted himself between them. Without wasting words, the judge read his decision aloud. "All charges against Danielle Brooks are hereby dismissed, effective immediately. Officers Moore and Wallace, you are to be remanded into custody pending formal federal indictment on multiple charges, including evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and civil rights violations." Moore stepped forward, face red. "This is a mistake. She's the one with the coke." "Enough," the judge barked, slamming the gavel. "You're done here." The courtroom fell silent. Danielle didn't look back. She didn't need to. The trap they set for her had snapped shut on themselves. Danielle Brooks didn't walk out of that courthouse satisfied with her own freedom. She walked out with a mission. The moment the charges against her were dropped and the cuffs on Moore and Wallace were tightened, she turned her attention to the deeper damage they had left behind. Through her work with Agent Vance and the DEA's legal division, Danielle submitted formal petitions to reopen every single case the two officers had ever touched. Some were recent, others dated back years, but all bore the same pattern: vague stops, missing evidence logs, and coerced confessions from individuals too scared or too underrepresented to fight back. Within 3 weeks, over a dozen cases were re-examined. Half a dozen convictions were overturned almost immediately when it became clear that the arrests were based on falsified reports or non-existent probable cause. One man, Eric Mays, had served nearly 7 years on a trafficking conviction built on a traffic stop Wallace orchestrated. His file contained notes from a canine unit that never arrived, a lab report with no original sample, and a confession he had consistently denied giving. Danielle sat across from him in a community legal clinic when he was released. She handed him a thick folder. Inside were contacts for housing, counseling, and pro bono attorneys. "You're not alone," she said quietly. She said the same thing to every one of them. No cameras, no reporters, no grandstanding. Danielle didn't care for recognition, she cared about closure. She met with families who had spent birthdays and holidays sending commissary funds and praying for appeals that never came. She showed them the evidence, the texts between Moore and Wallace, the tampered footage, the fake chain of custody entries. She didn't ask for forgiveness on behalf of the system. She just handed them truth, and for some that was enough to begin healing. For others, the pain ran deeper, tangled with lost years and broken reputations. Danielle helped them connect with advocacy groups that specialized in wrongful convictions, and where the budget fell short, she used her own personal funds to cover gaps in support. She knew the fight wasn't over. Moore and Wallace were just two pieces of a larger puzzle, and the patterns she'd uncovered suggested the corruption extended beyond Brookhaven. But she also knew momentum was on her side now. Each overturned case became another crack in the system. Each story shared behind closed doors added weight to the bigger investigation unfolding across multiple counties. And while the press tried to get her on camera to headline her as the undercover agent who brought the system down, Danielle declined every interview. Her name didn't need to be the story, justice did. Instead, she spent her days working out of a small field office the DEA had set up outside Atlanta, analyzing new data, reviewing precinct logs, and preparing briefing packets for the next round of indictments. At night, she visited those who had been freed, not as a savior, but as someone who had seen what they'd endured and refused to let it continue. For Danielle, that was the only justice that mattered, helping people pierce their lives back together quietly, patiently, and permanently. 3 weeks after the courtroom reversal that shook Brookhaven's police department to its core, Danielle Brooks returned to the very steps of the courthouse where she'd once been escorted in chains. This time there were no shackles, no accusations, and no orange jumpsuit. She wore a charcoal grey suit, heels that clicked with quiet certainty, and a calm, unwavering gaze that silenced even the most curious reporters. She didn't need a podium. She didn't need to defend herself. The truth had already done that. Cameras flashed, microphones extended toward her like hungry mouths, but Danielle simply spoke with the same measured tone she had carried through every interrogation, every false charge, and every moment of doubt. "Silence is the weapon of those who abuse power," she said. "But when you use that silence to observe, to document, to build truth, then justice can't be silenced." Her words rippled through the crowd, not as a rallying cry, but as a reminder. A reminder that calm does not mean weak, and that being quiet does not mean surrendering. Inside the courthouse behind her, a federal task force had already taken over 2 precinct offices linked to the same misconduct patterns she uncovered. Dozens of sealed indictments were being prepared, and while the press scrambled to cover the story of the DEA agent who turned the system on its head, Danielle had no interest in fame. She had returned not for attention, but for resolution. She met with the district attorney's office to discuss restitution for victims, then sat with internal affairs to share files and timelines they'd never seen. Some because they were buried, others because no one had dared to dig. Her work was far from over, but her name was finally cleared. And more importantly, others now had the chance to reclaim theirs. Discrimination doesn't always wear a uniform of profanity or slurs. Sometimes it hides behind a badge, behind a protocol, behind a checkbox marked standard procedure. It doesn't scream. It whispers. In a delayed phone call, in a missing piece of evidence, in a look that says, "You don't belong here." But true justice doesn't need to shout back. It needs to stand firm. It needs to outlast. And it needs to be built not on vengeance, but on facts, on proof that's undeniable. What Danielle proved wasn't just her own innocence. It was that even in a broken system, persistence can expose rot, and courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks in quietly, prepared. For those who feel powerless, who are dismissed because of how they look, where they're from, or what they've survived, remember this: you don't need permission to matter. You don't need permission to fight back. And if someone tries to rewrite your story using bias and assumption, take the pen back. Finish it yourself. Write it in bold, undeniable truth. Because power only controls you when you forget you have your own. And sometimes, the strongest form of resistance is refusing to go silent. The truth doesn't need volume. It needs precision. And it needs patience. Danielle's story reminds us that the law is only as just as those who enforce it. And when that fails, it is up to those wronged to turn quiet endurance into undeniable evidence. If this story moved you, if you believe that truth deserves to be heard, not just to expose, but to heal, then subscribe to X Daily Stories. We bring you narratives from the shadows, stories where justice doesn't scream, it stands. Hit the bell, share what matters, and help us keep telling the stories that were never meant to stay silent.